RC from the Mountain Top Joiner Shop here. Welcome to part 4 of my trestle table build series. In the previous installment, I had put together my end assemblies, which are basically my legs attached to the sled feet and the battens. So I have my trestle table ends all set up. Now I need to put something in between them so they're strong. So that's what I'm going to be doing in this episode. So as you can see here, I already got those long stretchers milled up here. This one's going to lay flat along the floor in between the sled feet. And that will keep the sled feet or the end assemblies from going this way when the table gets dragged around. And then I have this other one that's going to be a tall one that's going to support the underside of the top. And of course that is also going to be such that it prevents racking in parallel of the end assemblies. So hope that kind of makes sense. And the joinery I'm going to be doing for this is actually a joinery I've done before. And I first stumbled across this in a book by William Fairham, circa 1920. This is Woodwork Joints, and this is a reprint on Tulamera Press, and it's just full of illustrations of all kinds of joinery. It's awesome. Such a fun book. And on page 23 of that book, we have what he calls a crossed halving joint with housed corners. So it's kind of a variation on the half lap joint. So that's what I'm going to be doing here with these stretchers. This should be fun. Let's cut them out. All right, so I already have all my joinery laid out, and I have some knife lines here that I'm trying to deepen with a paring chisel. And the reason I'm doing that is I want to deepen these knife lines such that I can drop the saw plate right into them and get my cut started that way. I find that a very accurate way to get your saw cut started. So I'm taking a little bit of material off on this side of the knife line with a paring chisel, and then I'm going to deepen these knife lines with a chisel now that there's a little more support behind the chisel, and then deepening those some more after that. So let me go grab another chisel and deepen that down a little bit more. Let's come in here and just deepen that a little bit more. Come back this way again. And that'll allow me to get in here and make that a little bit deeper. There we go. That's what I want right there. So I have to go around to all these joints, do that for all of them, and then I'll show you how I saw them out. Okay, so I'm ready to start sawing these out. And it's not that different than cutting anything else out really. If you have the sawing skills, you can do it. And my line is right down the front, and there's my baseline where I'm going to stop. So I'm going to put my thumb here, so it's going to kind of block the view for a moment, but that's just in case my foolproof plan of dropping the teeth into this groove fails and it tries to jump over into the show face. Obviously, we don't want that. This actually isn't a show face anyway, so I don't have to worry about it too much, but I'm going to put my thumb right there just to prevent it. Force of habit, I guess. By the way, this isn't a very high stakes cut because the glue surface is actually going to be in the bottom here. That's where the long grain to long grain wood contact is going to be, and that's where the glue is going to be at strongest. This is all end grain that's going to be facing in here. So even if I don't saw this perfectly, and it's going to be housed later as well, so even if I don't saw it perfectly, it's not going to be seen later. All it has to do is allow the joint to go together. Sawing right down the line there, and every once in a while I'd like to take a peek at the back and just see if anything weird is going on back there, and there isn't. So. Just kissed it, and a little bit more on the other side. So I'm going to bias my saw up a little bit more. And now I'm touching it. Now, like I was saying before, if I undercut this, it's not that big a deal. It's going to be housed. It's not really a long grain to long grain glue surface. However, if I cut it this way, and it appears I've done that just a teeny tiny bit down here, that's material I'll just have to pare away with a chisel afterward. So, like I said, not a high stakes cut. I'm just getting it done. Now, without even moving the workpiece, I'm going to do a cut down here at the other end. So this workpiece is long enough that I can use the leg at the far end of my bench with a holdfast in it to hold this in place. So it's kind of like I have a vise at each end here. And because I am right-handed and right eye dominant, I have a little bit better accuracy sawing down the right side of a line than I do the left side of a line. So I'm going to go ahead and do this cut and then flip the whole board around and do the right side of each of these last two lines. And then I have a little notch here that I'm going to need to remove this material in between. So that's what's coming up next. So you can see when I put this in place, I use my sliding dead man with a surface clamp in it just to kind of support the board until I got it clamped up at that end. And then I put the hold fast in at this end. So this is a neat little trick I find for supporting workpieces better, even if your dog hole isn't quite high enough to support the workpiece. So I got these all sawed out and I'm ready to do the same on the other workpiece. There's a few more saw cuts involved with that, and the workpiece is also less tall than this one. So my little strategy of using my sliding dead man with a surface clamp to support this while I get a hold fast in it isn't going to work. You can see even with this one, the hold fast is just barely long enough to reach up here. So let me get this out of here and I'll show you how I'm going to immobilize that workpiece. That I'm going to end up putting on top of my workbench. Right now there's a bunch of sawdust up here, and I don't want this sawdust to kind of get ground between my bench top and the workpiece. So I need to get this sawdust off here, and I could just use my brush, but I usually just use my vacuum because it's right here. That's one thing that you have to really be careful of when you're nearing the finish prep stages of a given piece, is any kind of wood chips, sawdust, shavings, anything in between that and a workbench top can kind of grind against it and damage the surface enough that it makes your finish prep later on harder to deal with. So watch out for that. So my cuts are going to be right here, so I want to support this near the cut. Just like that. And if I wanted this to be even more secure, I could even put not hold fast, I could put surface, what do they call them? Planing stops. I could put planing stops behind this as well to kind of support it from going that way, but I think these clamps are going to hold it tight enough. Really quick before I start sawing this, actually, I wanted to show you something. So if you'll recall from the last installment of this video series that I made a point of doing the short shoulders of my tenons first with the saw, before I did the long shoulders of each of the tenons. And the reason for that is I didn't want so much of my saw plate to be buried in the kerf that the sawdust would get kind of trapped in the gullets and cause friction, cause the saw plate to expand, and then things get really hard to push, and then your sawing accuracy suffers. So what I'm going to do in this case is the same. I'm going to cut the sides of this first. This is a nice short length cut that my saw will have no problem with. And in so doing, I'm going to be cutting into here, and I'm only going to have this amount of material to saw away when I do my third cut. So this is one of those cross halving joints with housed corners that I was talking about at the beginning of the video. So I'm sawing into here down to about this baseline here. Same thing coming up this way. And there's just going to be a little stem in here. And I'm going to be removing the material from the top as well. So a lot going on here. This one's kind of fun. All right, now that I've done all of these shorter length cuts, I'm ready to do the longer length cuts. And when it comes to this kind of thing, it's all about immobilizing the workpiece so nothing moves while you're doing your sawing. In fact, just a moment ago while I was doing these shorter length cuts, I did get out my F-style clamps and clamp it down even tighter just to make sure nothing moved. I even had to move my desk clamp a couple of times because there was times when I couldn't really see what I was doing very well. I think I actually overcut one of these just a smidgen. But no matter. So now I'm going to be doing these longer cuts, and now that those cuts are actually shorter bits of material, the saw should have less trouble with that. So I'm going to get in there, and I'm going to be sawing about halfway through the thickness of the workpiece here. So let's get in there. And I have the previous kerf to drop the saw right into here to help me get started. Yeah, even now the saw feels a little bit grabby in there. And the kerf on either end here also helps guide the saw. So I don't even really have to worry about sawing out of kilter. I'm just kind of letting the saw follow the kerfs that are already established here and just letting it go. Now I have to leave the saw in the kerf and take a look behind here every once in a while to make sure I'm not overcutting my line. I'm just about to touch it right there. And let me look on that side again. Still a little bit high at the far end. I'm going to call it right there. So I need to do that at both ends and then flip the whole workpiece around and do it again on the other side of the cut. And then I have all this material to remove. And that presents a bit of a conundrum that we'll talk about when we get to that point. So I have these sidewalls sawed out and I need to remove the material in between them to complete this joint. And the first time I encountered this kind of problem, I was at a little bit of a loss, you see, because the obvious way to do this would be like a dado blade in a table saw, but this is a huge workpiece. So you need one of those huge table saws with a sliding table on it. I have neither the money nor the space for one of those. You could also use a router. If you could get a pattern bit into here somehow, maybe you could hog it out that way and they have a nice flat bottom. Of course, the spindle on the bits that I have wouldn't reach the bottom of this anyways. I've tried things like cutting it out with a coping saw, but this is pretty thick material and is white oak, so I'd just be sitting here sawing forever. So I have to cut one, cut that way, and then maybe cut the little hump out and come in the other way. So that's really not the most efficient use of my time. And then I've also done things like get out a panel saw and cut multiple kerfs down to the baseline here, and then split the material out with a chisel that way. And in doing so, it occurred to me that that really isn't necessary, that there is an easier way. It reminds me of a couple of sayings. So one is the KISS principle, you've probably heard of, which stands for keep it simple, stupid. And you shouldn't talk to yourself like that. It's kind of mean. And the other thing is, necessity is the mother of invention. Well, in my case, the father of invention is laziness. So I'm going to show you the lazy way to do this. I'm going to clamp this down to my bench and bring it in a little bit closer. All right, so given that all of this material has been kind of severed away from the rest of the board, this is all short grain, and as such it can be broken away pretty easily. You just have a little bit limited control over which direction the wood tends to split when you try to break it off. So that being the case, what I'm going to do is come in here with my chisel and a mallet, and rather than cut straight down and risk this kind of breaking off back into the baseline of the joint, I'm just going to angle my chisel outward like this. And you can angle as much as 45 or even more if you want. And then just take a little bit off at a time. Just like that. There goes a huge chunk of it. That can go in the fireplace later. That'll work out great. And getting closer to my baseline, I'm trying to take off more of a sloped cut. And thinner slices. And just as I get close to my baseline back here, I'm going to flip the workpiece over and do the same technique, cutting outward from the other side of the workpiece. So I went down to the other end of the board and I started cutting out that notch as well, and I'm going to flip the whole thing over end for end. And clamp that down. Get both ends here since I'm cutting away material at both ends of the workpiece. Now I'm going to angle out from the other direction. Taking a little bit smaller chunks this time. Or I should say thinner chunks. I'm working my way a little bit flatter. Just like that. Now I'm taking pretty thin pieces. Now I'm getting to the point where I'm starting to worry about undercutting again. So I'm going to flip it over again before I get all the way to the bottom of that. But you get the idea. I'm going to keep working my way down until I've gotten all the way to the bottom of that joint. So I flipped it over again, and I'm working back in from the other side again because the peak of this is moved towards this end of the joint. And if I was to keep chiseling from this direction, it makes it more likely that I'm going to split away a little bit of the baseline of my joinery, and I don't want to do that. So now I'm coming back in from the other side and starting to flatten out the joint. There we go. Now I'm taking really thin slices. Now there's very little material left to remove in the middle there. I can work away most of that with a paring chisel, so I'm going to set this up on end so I can get in there with a paring chisel and get rid of most of the rest of that waste. And when I go to the final kind of surfacing of the bottom of the joint, if my router plane blade is long enough to reach in the bottom of this, that's the way I prefer to do it because I can keep everything nice and flat quite easily. Failing that, I'm just going to have to get in here with a square and just do it all via paring chisel and just be very careful about it. But that's the way I like to remove big chunks of waste like that when they're sawed away from the long grain on either side. So you just have some short grain to remove. I've set my workpiece up on edge, and I've noticed that the peak of this waste is moved over to this edge now. And it gives me the confidence I can remove a little bit more of that just the same way I've been doing it, which is to tap it away with the chisel. I'm still angling upward just a little bit. And now there's hardly any hump at all. It's almost flat. So I can come in here with a paring chisel and work my way down to the baseline. But first I'd like to see if the router plane can reach that far down. So let me go grab that. Nope, not reaching. Wah, wah, wah. So now I got this clamped down on my leg vise. I'm going to come in here with a paring chisel and try to work away the rest of the material. So I'm going to take little thin bites with the chisel that's not that wide because this white oak grain is quite stubborn and it's easier to push a narrower chisel. Like that. And I'll work my way across and take those shapings off. So I'm going to peek over the backside once in a while, make sure that I'm not flirting with the baseline too closely. And then I'll take another little thin shaving. And one of the advantages of using a paring chisel is its extra length. Gives you a really good tactile judgment, not to mention a visual judgment of how level you are when you're entering the cut. So it makes it less likely that I'm going to come in here and undercut the joint so much. All right, so now to really play it safe, I'm not even going to exit the back side of the joint here. So I'm working my way down to the baseline on this side and then trying to level it out as I go in there. I'm just about ready to sink the end of my paring chisel right into that knife line where the baseline is. I'm just going to get as much off as I can before I take that final step. And right there, I'm actually touching that baseline now. So now I'm going to sink this paring chisel right into the baseline. I can see visually that it's parallel with the floor. And I'm just going to go for it. Give me a little bit of wiggle as I go. There we go. And I'm going to work my way to the edges. Once I feel satisfied that I've reached the bottom of this joint okay, I'm going to do the same thing from the other side and kind of meet in the middle here. Then I'll just check it to make sure there isn't a little bit of a hump left over. Because I'm erring on the side of caution, there probably will be just a little bit of a hump, and I will pare that away, checking it with the square as I go along to make sure that this bottom is nice and flat. So I got this flipped around again. I'm over to the other end of my bench, and I'm working in from the back side of that same joint. So again, I'm taking little nibbles off with the paring chisel. Like that's too big a chunk, it doesn't want to come off without me having to apply a ton of pressure. So I'm backing it off, taking smaller chunks. Of course, it would probably help if I actually sharpen this paring chisel beforehand. I think it's already pretty sharp, but you can tell there's a little bit of a hump back here, so I'm bypassing the front entirely. Move some of that away. Now there's just a tiny bit of material left there. And again, I'm sneaking up to that baseline, taking as thin a shavings as I can along the way. Now there's only that tiniest bit left. I'm going to go right into the middle, feel for that knife line at the end of the paring chisel, make sure I'm good and level, and wiggle my way in. Now I'm going to work my way over with the corner of the chisel to each side. I reach the middle of the joint, I can actually feel that there's a little bit of a hump there. That's fine. Better than the alternative, which is to accidentally undercut it so it's not flat. I don't want this to have a dip in the middle. So I'll come in here with an engineer's square, get down to where I can see, and it's pretty clear to me that there's a hump through the middle there. That's just a little bit on this side of the joint. So I'm going to very carefully take very thin shavings off where that hump is. I'm just looking for high spots and very gently removing those. Same deal, but I'm just going to rinse and repeat, and you can see this is already getting pretty flat. So if I cut with a skew like that, it's easier to get the material to kind of give up and let go. It's a kind of more of a, not so much a skew as like a slicing cut. And of course, that slicing cut leaves a little bit smoother surface in there, which in turn makes for a better glue joint. I'm just going to reestablish these corners here so it's easier to remove that extra material from there. Got it. There you have it. Nice and flat, good glue surface, a joint ready to go together, done entirely with chisels. Okay, so the next workpiece that I'm cutting a similar type joint out on is a little bit different in some ways. For one, I'm removing material from 3 adjacent sides of the workpiece. And that gap that I'm removing the material from is quite a bit longer than in the example I just showed you. So the first thing I did was whack it with a mallet and see which way the grain is running. So I'd take a little chunk out of the corner there just to see if it was straight grained or not, and it is quite straight grained. So that allowed me to kind of have at it and remove material pretty aggressively. So I started out the same way as before, removing material at kind of a slope until I got close to my baseline on one side of the workpiece, and then I flipped it over and did the same, removing material until I got close to my baseline again, and then removing any large hump that was in the middle. And then I have pretty close to a flat bottom that is nearing the baseline of the joint. And now I'm just paring away that material with a paring chisel. And let me show you a little technique for that. I wanted to zoom out for a second and show you some technique that I'm using with this paring chisel. For one, I have my workpiece at about waist height, and then I'm spreading out my feet and kind of anchoring my dominant hand against my hip right here. So my wrist is kind of pinned to my hip. And then I'm just basically holding the chisel and kind of guiding it with my hands, but I'm actually pushing the chisel with my whole body. So I'm just kind of moving forward with my hips and pushing it like that. And this is far more easy to control than it would be if I was just using my hands out here in space and just, stabbing at it with a paring chisel. You run the risk of having your chisel blow out the backside of the joint and ruin some of the keeper part of your joint. And of course, there's always a risk of stabbing yourself with a sharp chisel, so you don't want to do that either. And speaking of sharp, this technique gives you so much more control that you can even get away with using a chisel that's not that sharp and still be pretty effective and pretty accurate at removing the material. That said, generally speaking, a tool that is sharp is safer to use, actually, because it gives you more control. And of course, a chisel that is sharp also gives you more accuracy because it's going to remove the material more cleanly than if it was really blunt. So I still recommend sharpening once in a while. I know I do get lazy about it from time to time. When you use good technique like this, it allows you to be a little bit lazy about it and kind of put it off a little longer before you have to go over and sharpen again. So I'm just sneaking down real close to my baseline here. And this cut is actually shallow enough that my router plane can reach into the bottom of it. So when I get close to the bottom of this, real close, I'm going to finish off the joint with the router plane. Okay, so I did all that paring and I'm down real close to my baselines now. So I just need to finish this joint off. And luckily for me, I'm able to do that with a router plane. It reaches down into the bottom of this, and using the router plane makes it such that I don't have to worry about the bottom of this being flat. So I have to sit with the square and look for the high spots and pare those away and check it again. Don't have to do any of that. And I have the top of the workpiece facing the camera because this material here is all getting removed. So I don't have to worry about breaking any pieces off of here when I exit the cut with this router plane. So now I'm on here just removing the material until I get down to my baselines. Now, when I'm in the middle of this joint, I have no problem supporting the router from both sides, but I do have to be aware that when I'm over to one side or the other, I lose my support. So I have to make sure that when I'm over here, I put a lot of weight down on this hand. And when I'm over here, I have to do the opposite to make sure that I don't tilt the router plane into the bottom of this cut. So I'm going to take little nibbles. So basically my bench chisel is what I was hogging off the waste with. The paring chisel I was kind of taking medium bites with. And the router takes itty bitty bites. And as such, oops, see I just tilted it a little bit. And as such, the router will leave a cleaner surface that is more conducive to a strong glue line. So I'm going to advance my router a little bit at a time. I'm going to play with skewing the blade to one side just to see how clean of a cut it leaves. It's pretty good, so I'm going to advance it once and skew it in the other direction and see how that compares. Man, I mean, they're both pretty nice. So I guess as long as I just skew it, I'm getting a nice smooth surface. And I'm watching my baseline on this side so I know when to stop. So I'm just going to keep on advancing my blade, taking tiny bites until I get to the bottom of this joint. And I have to do that on the other side, which you probably can't see down here, and on the other end of this workpiece. So I'm going to be doing this for a little bit, and then I just have to remove this material on top here. Okay, so now I just have this kind of stem here. I removed material from both sides. Now I need to remove half the thickness off the top of this, so that stem is just going to be along the bottom here. And because I removed the material on the sides, I no longer have a baseline which I can work to. So I set a wheel gauge to half the thickness of the workpiece, and that is going to reestablish my baseline for the material I have yet to remove. And I'm using the bottom of the workpiece as my reference edge. So I'm going to go lefty on the other side here and reestablish that line. And when it comes to removing the remainder of this material, I'll be using the same combination of techniques I've been showing you all along here. So I'm just going to go ahead and have at it. I'm going to chisel away this waste, pare away until I'm close to my baselines, and then remove the remainder and clean it up with a router plane. So once I've finished all that work, we'll go ahead and take a look at our mating pieces, mark out the mating joinery, cut that out, and do a dry fit before this is all said and done. Or that's the hope anyways. So let's see how this goes. Okay, so now I'm back to the workpiece that I actually started this video with. This is the stretcher that's going to go up underneath the tabletop. So this whole assembly is going to go like this. It's all upside down right now. And I know of no better way to mark out the joinery for the mating pieces than to just line up the pieces with each other and then mark it with a knife. It's very similar to when you're laying out your tail boards to your pin boards and just transferring the marks with a marking knife. So I'll bring you in closer here and you can see what I mean. So again, this is kind of hard to show on camera because it's white oak and none of my marking lines are that readily visible, but I got you as close as I could so you can see what's going on here. So I got my battens upside down on the table and I have the stretcher that I want to interface with that upside down as well, laying on top of it. I made it such that these cuts in this notch here are a centimeter in from each side on the batten. So that much I already knew, and that was intentional. So I was able to draw layout lines here and here to show 1 centimeter in. So I'm able to center the batten left or right that way. And then as far as centering it along the length of the batten, I took the ends of my mortises and transferred a pencil line out from those. So it's easy to measure from the face of this stretcher to that layout line and see how that distance is. So I can make sure that this is the same distance here and the same on the back side, because remember there's a mortise on the other side that has the exact same line on it. And that's how I know that I'm centered along the length of the battens. And then of course it's important to check to make sure that I am square, like so. So I went around and around and around until I got this perfectly lined up. And the main thing that I need to transfer as far as my marks are concerned is where I'm going to notch in on this batten right here. So I can put a little bit of weight down on top of this stretcher here and then just put my mark right there. Just like that. And do the same on the other side. Of course, the camera's in the way. And it doesn't have to be super deep. I just need to be able to see it after I remove this batten. And then I can kind of deepen those lines and make them easier to see and work from. After I've got this removed, I can just put a square up to it and deepen the line that way. So that is how I am marking out where I want to notch these battens for this to fit over it. Eventually, these will interface with each other perfectly, hopefully. That's the idea anyways. So now I have my little knife marks on top of here, and I can just transfer those lines around the sides of the workpiece. So I know that this side here is my reference edge. I got a little tick mark right there. So I'm going to use that edge as my reference for transferring this around the bottom and that far edge there. So I'm going to go like this and put my knife right into that knife line that's on top. Slide my square up to it and transfer my line around the side here. Just need to continue to do that. Transfer those lines around the edges. And once that's all laid out, I can notch out this part of the batten. So here's my batten with the notches cut out of it. And when I was routing out this down to the marking lines, I just took a little bit off at a time from both sides to make sure that this stays centered, and then tried to sneak up on the fit. And I screwed up a little bit, so I want to show you how I screwed up so you know not to do that. So when I was trying to test the fit, I was putting the joint together straight on like this, and the problem is this doesn't tell you where you're too fat. So I took a little bit too much material off of these faces. Now thankfully these aren't really glue faces, and a lot of the strength of this joint is going to be coming from these shoulders, and the shoulders still fit tight. So word to the wise, if you're doing a house joint like this, when you're testing the fit, come on from the corner like this and see how it fits then. Then you know if you're snug or not. And then when you drive it from this side, if it doesn't want to go together, then you know that your shoulders are a little too tight. But in this case, they're all right. So when I drive it together, looks like that. And so there's a lot of strength in this from the shoulders, but also, of course, in the bottom of this, there is a long grain glue joint. And I don't know, if I'm feeling cute, I might even put a screw right down through the middle of there. And That'll make it even stronger yet. One last technique I'd like to show you before I wrap this episode up. I have my sled feet here, and because they're the exact same thickness, the same length, everything, the same joinery, that's the same width, the same depth and all that, I line them up with each other so you can see I actually have them both right here. So they don't slide back and forth. I have a hold fast on each of them, and now when I route them, I'm actually able to route both of them at the same time instead of routing them one at a time. So this is almost literally twice as fast to clean up the bottoms of these half laps. Alright, so here's that joint ready to go. So this is my sled foot. I got my mortises for the bottoms of the legs right here. And underneath I have the cutout for the stem of the, what I'm going to call the floor stretcher, I guess. You can see how it lines up, just like that. And it fits together like that. I might have to flush that up a little bit, but I gotta say that went together pretty well. Okay, so that is about it for all the, at least the serious kind of hand-cut joinery in this project. And I've kept all the parts that I'm working with square for the sake of doing that joinery. It makes your layout much simpler. And now that I've got the bulk of that joinery done, a lot of these parts are ready for shaping now. And that's when a project really starts to come into its own. It becomes less of a mechanical contrivance and more of a thing of beauty at that point. And it's one of my favorite parts of woodworking as well. So that's what's coming up in the next episode. I hope you'll join me for that. We'll see you then. Now, if you like what you saw here, please hit like and subscribe. It would help me out a lot. Also hit the little bell icon if you want to be notified anytime I release a new video. And if you didn't like what you saw here, keep it to yourself, pal. Or watch one of my other videos. You might like one of those. Thank you for watching.